the World Food Program is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Yet while it highlights the agency's work, can the prize also draw attention to the use of food as a weapon in conflict zones? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. This year's Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the World Food Program, a United Nations agency with its headquarters in Rome. In the public mind, the WFP is often associated with famine relief, but its mandate is actually much broader. In a moment, we'll bring in our guests and discuss the work the agency does with refugees and in war zones, along with the disaster and famine relief it's best known for. But first, this report from our diplomatic editor, James Bays.
And so we work with the people on rehabilitating the land with what we call half moons, and now we have...
The head of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, was on a trip to West Africa. He'd been in Burkina Faso and then was in Niger, two countries blighted by conflict and hunger, when he heard the news.
I mean, this is the first time in my life I've been speechless. I mean, this is unbelievable. Talk about the most exciting point in time in your life is the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's because of the WFP family. They're out there in the most difficult, complex places in the world, whether it's war, conflict, climate extremes, it doesn't matter. They're out there and they deserve this award. And wow, 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 wow. I can't believe it.
Before the Nobel announcement, some had predicted the Peace Prize might go to the World Health Organization, but that would have been controversial. The agency and its head, Dr. Tedros, are at the center of disputes between the US and China, with the Trump administration pulling its funding. Instead, another part of the UN family deeply impacted by COVID-19 was chosen.
For its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict.
The World Food Programme has had a major logistical challenge delivering food this year, with large parts of the global shipping and aviation networks closed. Instead, it's had to find alternatives. One expert told me WFP is currently probably the largest airline in Africa. The award goes to the agency for its work and to all its 17,000 staff. But Executive Director David Beasley has been a bold and passionate leader, repeatedly linking conflict and hunger in his speeches in the UN Security Council. The job has, since the 1980s, always gone to an American. Mr. Beasley is a former Republican governor of South Carolina who knows President Trump well. He's had a difficult year, himself contracting COVID-19 early in the pandemic, but he ends it with the presentation of the award in December, recognition of the agency's ever-growing workload. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
You want it. It's all of us.
All right, let's bring in our guests. From Juba in South Sudan, Matthew Hollingworth, the World Food Programme's South Sudan Country Director. From Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Emma Leslie, Director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And from Paris, Ole Solvang, Director of Partnerships and Policy for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you all for joining us. Matthew, let me start with you. First, let me say congratulations on this tremendous honor to you and all your colleagues with the World Food Programme. What is this going to mean for you, for the World Food Programme, and for all the people that you're trying to help in places like South Sudan?
And clearly, for all of the family of the World Food Programme around the world, we're thrilled and sort of honoured by what this amazing achievement and the recognition, of course, of the work that we've been doing over the last few years, but in particular this year as the world suffers and struggles through COVID-19, and also the recognition, of course, that hunger and war and conflict goes hand in hand, and the world needs to do everything it can alongside the World Food Programme and the World Food Programme alongside them to stop that and break that linkage. So it's a great honour, and I believe that it will spur us on in our task and our responsibilities.
Emma, from your perspective, how much does the fact that the international community has of late repeatedly failed to mediate conflicts and disputes around the world, how much has that led to this massive increase we've seen around the world in food insecurity?
Yeah, I think firstly, let me say congratulations to our friends and colleagues and their partners at the World Food Programme. But absolutely, I think the Nobel Committee is actually reminding us all that we are living in an era of very complex, complicated, systemic, structural violence conflicts, that we actually need to scale up our commitment and resources to prioritising the resolution of those. But actually that somehow we've also failed, and that we really need to review our models of mediation, dialogue, invest heavily in preventive diplomacy. And we have spent a lot of the last couple of decades looking at preventing violent extremism and so on, but we haven't really delved deeper into the sort of analysis of where conflicts are coming from. And some of those conflicts, South Sudan, Rakhine in Myanmar, Korean Peninsula, are also getting swept up in geopolitics, economic demand, and of course are led by very real structural violence causes.
Ole, how much has conflict-driven hunger and food insecurity increased these past few years? How bad is the situation?
Well, what we're seeing is that the situation is quite bad. Already at the beginning of this year, we saw that, we saw warning signs and we saw warning numbers that that food insecurity was on the increase. In many places in the world. East Africa is one of them. The Sahel is another one on that. And then on top of that, we also got COVID-19. At the Norwegian Refugee Council, we did a study recently where we asked people in many of the places where we operate how COVID-19 had impacted them. And we found that many people were saying that they had lost income because of COVID-19. And about 70% of those we interviewed said that they had fewer meals to put on their tables as a result of COVID-19. So it's clear that what we saw earlier, than the increasing warning signs around hunger and famine and warnings of famine, and then you get COVID-19 on top of that, makes us in a very precarious situation right now. So this is in that sense a very, very timely award.
Matthew, you heard earlier there now just talk about how precarious the situation has become because of COVID-19. Let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, what about COVID-19? How has the pandemic exacerbated a situation that is already so dire for so many people, so many vulnerable populations in conflict zones that are already on the brink of starvation?
Well, certainly. I mean, our greatest challenge here in South Sudan is the fact that conflict is so persistent, and that conflict has gotten us where we are today in terms of the enormity of the food insecurity problem here. What COVID-19 has done has just added an additional layer of complexity to that and made our lives a lot harder because it's so much more expensive to do our work. In South Sudan itself, communities are facing very significant shortfalls of revenue because the currency is depreciated by 65% in the last year, primarily down to COVID, but also the price of oil dropping in the world. But at the same time, all of the commodities that come into this country, and so many people are dependent on markets to cover their food needs, are so much more expensive now as well. So we now face this double challenge of the people who are displaced because of conflict, rural areas in particular, suffering, and now a new urban caseload of people who, because of COVID-19, are not making the livelihoods they used to make, don't have the jobs they used to have, don't have the revenue to cover their basic needs. And of course, 3/4 of everything that people spend typically in South Sudan is on food. So when food prices are hiked, people really start to suffer, and households really suffer.
Emma, I've read some of your reporting where you talk about the fact that conversations these days about peace building too often start from the point of COVID-19, and that you'd like to challenge organizations and groups working toward peace from focusing on it so much, and to refocus energy and resources to ending violent conflict. How would that be achieved at a time like this?
I mean, we've seen some really creative initiatives. The Secretary General's call for ceasefires. We've seen renewed discussions around the impact of sanctions in the moment of this. I mean, actually, if you took the Korean Peninsula as an example, this would be precisely the time to fast track the end of the war. So there are a number of things that we can be doing right now, precisely as has been said, that COVID creates this other complication. But it's not like these conflicts weren't complicated and protracted for quite some time. So I think we need to be very careful that we stay focused on that and that we go back to understanding that conflicts, especially at local levels, begin by exclusion. They begin by policies and constitutions and structures that prohibit people from access to their land. It begins with displacement, and that's precisely why organisations like the World Food Programme then have to come in and do the work that they do, because people don't have access to the very basic resources and needs that they have, and that's why armed groups emerge, so on and so forth. So our concern is that while we focus on the pandemic, which is obviously important, that we'll lose sight of the fact that these conflicts have been bubbling away there for quite some time, and that we need a lot more creativity and very simple things we can do. We can end the war on the Korean Peninsula. We can change the isolation of some countries. We can bring stronger efforts for preventive diplomacy, but equally we need to change our models of mediation. And I think this is something that we haven't talked a lot about. We have this system of bringing in envoys, sort of big man mediation, but it's really time to review that and think differently about our multi-track diplomacy approaches. It's time to work collaboratively. We need to take our egos out of it. It's time to really knuckle down and put some of this to rest, because it's not good for economies, not good for stability, not good for the lives of people. And kudos to the Nobel Committee for making that point by supporting the World Food Programme, who's doing their best to mitigate that, to hold the front. But those of us in mediation, peace building, conflict resolution work have to step it up.
Ole, let's talk for a few moments about Yemen. Yemen, of course, is the country that's considered to be the site of the world's worst humanitarian disaster, a man-made disaster, as it were. Now, the Norwegian Refugee Council says that Yemeni farms have been hit at least 918 times by airstrikes and shelling in less than 3 years, which further exacerbates Yemen's severe food crisis. How close is Yemen to famine right now?
I mean, it's clear that we are extremely close to a very dangerous situation. But the point here is also that it is not too late yet. And this is a point where all parties to that conflict really have to step back and take measures to make sure that that we don't get to that point. And there are many different aspects to this conflict and to most conflicts, right? You mentioned all the airstrikes, etc. That's one of it. But we also see in many places that we are, as humanitarians, often faced with obstacles in terms of delivering humanitarian assistance. And this is one other, reason why I think the award to WFP is such a great and timely award. What a lot of people don't perhaps know is that in many of these situations, WFP is actually the backbone of the humanitarian response in many ways, because they provide logistical support. So when I went to Yemen last, for example, it was by support of a WFP flight. But that has to do with access, and it has to do with, all parties in Yemen in particular, but all of the conflicts as well, really have to recognize the humanitarian principles that humanitarian aid is neutral and objective, and really facilitate the delivery of aid in these situations. So there's several aspects to this, but it's, I think the main message on Yemen here is that it is an extremely, extremely precarious situation, but it's not too late yet to avoid some of the worst consequences there.
Matthew, I saw you nodding along to some of what Ole was saying, so let me also talk to you briefly about Yemen. Yemen is a country that I used to report from quite often. I remember doing stories about how bad childhood malnutrition was in 2011, long before this current conflict started. When you're hearing Ole talk about the difficulties, the logistical difficulties of getting aid, of getting food, of getting support into Yemen, how tough is it right now, especially for the WFP, to get much needed support into a place like Yemen?
I mean, whether we're talking about Yemen or Syria or even here in South Sudan, vast amounts of energy and resources go into ensuring that the logistics works, that we have every means possible to meet the challenges of access in complex emergencies, in human-induced emergencies. But of course, I mean, that's the point. They're all man-made. And the obstacles that are being thrown up by individuals, by people, by governments who are hindering and hampering and making our operations harder. I mean, I think this is why it's so important on the advocacy side that we recognise that these things can be made simpler. They can be made easier. And the harder they are, the more expensive the assistance becomes. The more expensive the logistics becomes. And the more difficult it is to resource operations that could be spending more of the resources on genuinely saving lives and then changing the lives of people in countries. I mean, what we know in most conflict zones is that, unfortunately, conflict returns. You have this conflict trap in persistent, long-term, protracted areas of crisis. And of course, part of the reason that happens is because we spend a vast amount of money on the emergency response. And then when we do, in some cases, get to an absence of conflict, or better still, some peace, that's when the aid dwindles and the development money dwindles. And because of that, we go back into conflict. So if we could actually break that back of recognizing that making things harder, continuing conflict for political purposes, and making the aid harder to reach is really going to make, in the long term, the response in those countries in getting communities back on their feet far harder. I mean, I again, from our side in South Sudan, I can tell you we have a full-time team that does nothing else look at conflict sensitivity, conflict analysis, and access negotiation. I mean, again, were things easier, we could be spending those resources on more food and more assistance. That's the same in Yemen, that's the same in Syria, that's the same in all of the complex emergencies we work in. And I mean, I think it's worth saying 80% of the World Food Programme's resources globally go to human-induced, man-made crises. And obviously, we would rather be spending that money on the longer-term development kind of activities, resilience-building activities that help communities become self-reliant, self-sustaining, and not need humanitarian aid to exist.
Emma, it looked very much to me like you might have wanted to jump in and add to what Matthew was saying. Did you?
Sure. I mean, a part of this, I think, is that we're just hungry as a planet, I would think, for some kind of leadership that helps us to step into that space as been described. I think we really need egoless, values-driven collaboration around trying to solve some of these man-made problems, because we do have climate change. It's predominantly man-made. We are in this geopolitical standoffs over particular places in the world. And as has been said, is that these things repeat themselves. I'm sitting in Cambodia, a country that, as a small country, makes difficult decisions about which power it sits with and how does it meet its needs. So I think we're in this moment in history yet again, 2020, where conflict is complex, people are left out, and it's not always about economics. It's more often about exclusion, about identity, about dignity, and people getting access to land, basic land, which they can feed themselves. I think these are very fundamental, simple things, but it's going to take that kind of leadership, which will take us forward into the post-2020 era and be able to solve some of these things.
Ole, if we could pick up a bit on what Emma was saying, that conflicts are complex, especially right now. On the one hand, wars and conflicts can lead to conditions of food insecurity. We know that. But then there are also scholars and analysts who say that food insecurity can also give rise to violence and political conflict. So in some sense, it becomes a bit like a catch-22, does it not?
I mean, it's clear it is a cyclist, right? Where food insecurity, hunger is a result of conflict, but it's also lack of resources and lack of access to land and lack of access to food is also fueling competition and fueling conflict. And we also see in some cases that hunger and access to food and humanitarian assistance is used very politically and even as a weapon of war in several cases. I think there are three main things that we need to be doing now. One is we really, in recognition of the threat and the increased hunger that we're seeing, we need to make sure that we continue sort of the humanitarian support, the humanitarian assistance to both address the immediate need, but also looking at sort of more the longer term needs and looking at the systems, looking at the food and agricultural systems, etc., to make sure that we address those needs. A second issue is really to look at this access issue. We need to be able, as humanitarian actors, to have access to those who are most in need, those who are hardest to reach. And so here there is a role and responsibility both for the armed conflict parties, whether they're non-state armed groups, but also governments in some cases that are putting a lot of obstacles in our way, but also for international bodies such as the UN Security Council to really take this seriously. And then third, I think it's right what Emma is saying, that we need to be looking at the long-term drivers and the triggers of conflict. We need to invest more in preventative measures. And while I agree that COVID-19 perhaps is a bit of a distraction from some of the underlying root causes at this point, I think COVID-19 is also an opportunity here. The UN Security Council has asked for a cessation of hostilities. They need to follow up on that, and we need to have renewed efforts to make sure that we're able to address some of these humanitarian needs and solve these situations in a long-term perspective as well.
Matthew, the Nobel Committee said that the world is in danger of experiencing a hunger crisis of inconceivable proportions if the World Food Program and other food assistance organizations do not receive the financial support they have requested. The WFP, of course, is so heavily dependent on donations to do its critical work around the world. At a time of such vast wealth, how frustrating is it for you that it is so difficult for the WFP and for other food assistance organizations to get the funds that they need from the international community?
I mean, I think you've answered my question. It is incredibly frustrating, particularly when you see, the wealth that does exist in the world, the trillionaires and billionaires that control so much wealth, when there are families that we work with on a daily basis for whom a meal is a luxury. We are very well funded, I should say. Our donors are enormously, in particular donor governments, are enormously generous with their assistance. They are generous with that assistance also because they recognize that global security, global stability is also part and parcel of the hunger equation, just as conflict and hunger are linked, so is global stability and global prosperity. Now, our issues, though, is that we simply do not have the resources to cover all of the needs in the world today. There are 690 million people who are hungry when they go to sleep. We serve, as the World Food Program, around 100 million people a year in over 80 programs, so 80 countries in the world. We know that we're not getting to as many people as we should be, and we know that global hunger is on the increase. In South Sudan itself, for example, the best case that we can actually hope to cover in terms of the 5 million people that we support in South Sudan is that we can give them 50% of the ration that they need to have a healthy life. But we give that 50% ration because that's all we can resource. If we spread the blanket any thinner than that, then we start to question whether we can have a genuine impact on people's nutrition needs or meeting people's nutrition needs. And this is not the only country where that is the case. So it is frustrating, but at the same time, we have to recognize that there are donor governments in the world that do an amazing job supporting us, but more could be done. And I think there is obviously a need for relooking, and I think, as was mentioned, at the way we work, and actually trying to have a different approach, where it's not only donor governments that are, or donor member states that are supporting our kind of work, but also individuals, companies as well. The private sector needs stability, needs prosperity. If a global market is to help them continue, they also need to take on some of this responsibility as well.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we are going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all our guests, Matthew Hollingworth, Emma Leslie, and Ole Solvang. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.